A priceless Swiss brooch vanishes during a quiet country gathering. The guests smile politely, but fear flickers behind their eyes. When a body turns up and the brooch mysteriously reappears, everyone believes the mystery is over, but Miss Marple knows. The real story has only just begun. It was a morning scented with lavender and the faintest whisper of honeysuckle, the kind Miss Marple always associated with quiet thoughts and unspoken memories. In her garden at Danny, she moved gently between the rose beds, clipping with precision, but not haste, the petals falling like silken sighs into her basket. It was in such moments she often reflected, not with melancholy, but with a kind of practical tenderness, on the patterns of people, how they were shaped not only by circumstance, but by habit, by pride, and by the very small things they chose not to say. When the maid came with word from the vicarage that there had been a disturbance during evennong, Miss Marple laid down her shears, and after a pause removed her gardening gloves. A widow, they said, Mrs. Blackwell. Peaceful, they assumed. But Miss Marple had long since learned that death in St. Mary-me was seldom quite what it seemed. The church remained hushed even after the last hymn had faded, the final notes lingering in the timbers of the roof. Mrs. Rosalind Blackwell had not risen when the others did, had not turned to acknowledge the vicar's blessing. It was young Lily from the choir who first noticed her stillness and hesitated to speak. Such things were not to be declared hastily, especially in church. When Dr. Haywood arrived, summoned discreetly by a whispering curate, he confirmed what most had already suspected. The widow had passed. She sat slightly turned to one side as though listening, her pale hands folded atop her lap. Only the brooch drew the eye away. A remarkable piece of silver filigree set with 3 stones, pale blue, cold as glacier water, pinned just beneath her shoulder. It glinted oddly under the stained glass light. Miss Marple, who had arrived quietly after the congregation had dispersed, stood near the aisle, her expression unreadable. She did not step forward, did not interfere. Instead, she looked at the body, the brooch, and then the space around it, the silence that pressed in not from reverence, but from something else, something colder. Later that evening, over a modest supper in the vicarage dining room, the subject of the brooch arose, tentatively at first, then with a touch more curiosity. The vicar's wife, a woman of gentle manner and precise recollection, declared she had never seen Mrs. Blackwell wear such a piece. She was fond of pearls, she noted, slicing a corner from her bread pudding. Always simple. This brooch, well, it seemed rather foreign, didn't it? Others murmured agreement. It was not just beautiful. It was pointedly out of place. Miss Marple, stirring a drop of cream into her tea, said nothing, but she made a mental note, as she often did, to visit the church again in the morning. Not to disturb, only to observe. Objects, she knew, carried meanings far beyond their metal and stone, especially when they appeared at the moment of death. Dr. Haywood was a competent man, practical, respected, not prone to dramatics. He had declared Mrs. Blackwell's passing as heart failure, likely sudden, perhaps prompted by the chill in the church, or some unseen weariness. There would be no need, he assured the vicar, for further inquiry. But Miss Marple had seen something he had not, or perhaps had not thought significant. The pin of the brooch, though carefully fastened, had bent unnaturally, as though forced through heavy fabric, not made to hold it. Moreover, the widow's collar bore a faint, almost imperceptible tear, repaired swiftly, but poorly, as though someone had altered her clothing very recently, perhaps even after she had dressed. Miss Marple remembered, too, the unnatural stillness of her posture, not the peace of a woman overcome by age, but a silence that had been placed upon her, a finality made tidy for the sake of appearances. Death in the form it had taken that evening seemed too well arranged to be entirely innocent. She did not contradict the doctor, but in her mind a small knot had begun to form, not accusingly, simply, quietly. It was rarely the facts that mattered first. It was their arrangement. The following morning, Miss Marple returned to the church under the pretense of placing flowers, white lilies, from her garden. She moved with unhurried reverence through the pews, pausing by the seat where Mrs. Blackwell had been found. The cushions had already been reset, the area made pristine, but the faint scent of old lavender still lingered. What caught her attention most, however, were the gloves, left behind, carefully placed on the pew rail by someone meaning to preserve dignity. They were finely made, but old, darned in several places with such delicacy that one had to look closely to see the repairs. This was not the vanity of wealth. It was the preservation of appearance, despite quiet hardship. To Miss Marple, it suggested pride. A woman too proud to ask, too silent to admit, and perhaps too frightened to let go of what little remained of her dignity. Gloves like brooches could say a great deal. When one had lived long enough to learn how to listen, the church was empty now. Hollow in that way only English churches can be when left to their stillness. Miss Marple remained a moment longer after the verger passed through. The brooch, of course, had been taken into safekeeping, but its echo remained, lingering on the edge of something unsaid. She sat in the pew behind the one Mrs. Blackwell had occupied, and allowed her eyes to rest upon the altar, the windows, and the quiet air between them. The woman's face in death had not borne peace. It had borne restraint. Something kept in, or something left too late. Miss Marple considered not the manner of dying but the sequence surrounding it. Why the brooch? Why now? And above all, why Mrs. Blackwell? There had been, she thought, something delivered by post or by hand that morning. Not seen, but felt. Some token from the past, perhaps meant for reckoning. It was not always murder that killed. Sometimes it was memory. The sitting room at the vicarage was filled with the soft clink of china and the rustling of skirts as cups were passed and scone politely declined, then quietly accepted. The ladies of St. Mary Me assembled under the courteous invitation of Mrs. Harmon did not raise their voices nor permit anything so universalized as direct accusation, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Mrs. Blackwell's passing so sudden and so still had unsettled the equilibrium of the village. She had her ways, murmured Mrs. Weatherbeeby, her tone suggesting a measured reserve. Always walked the same route, same shawl, same hat. Never lingered for Chad. And never at the Women's Guild, added Mrs. Simpkins, helping herself to a cucumber sandwich. Not since 1954, and that was only because the bishop's niece was speaking. Miss Marple, seated by the window with her knitting in her lap, gave a small nod. She did not offer comment, but her mind, quiet and efficient as ever, was listening not for what was said, but for what was repeated and what was conspicuously avoided. It was the beginning, she sensed, of something far older than it appeared. Of all the names mentioned over tea, one drew a certain tightened glance among the guests. Annalisa, the Swiss companion. The term itself seemed to carry its own quiet condemnation. Neither friend nor servant, yet always present. Mrs. Blackwell's companion of some 7 years, and yet how little the villagers claimed to know her. She's very reserved, said Mrs. Price, hesitating over the word as though sifting for one less accusatory. Not impolite, but rather too refined, if you take my meaning. I saw her at the grocer's once, said Mrs. Banbury, reading labels aloud in French, if you please. The ladies gave murmurs of discomfort. There was something unsettling, after all, in a foreign woman speaking softly in a language one did not understand, even when doing something as innocent as selecting marmalade. Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, noting the subtext. Annalisa had lived in England for years, yet still remained unclaimed by the village. Forage, even when dressed in silk and good manners, lingered like a draught under a closed door, and that, Miss Marple thought, could be as isolating as any outright cruelty. As the teapot was refilled and the light grew more golden across the drawing-room carpet, the conversation took a deeper turn into the territory of money, which in villages like St. Mary Me was never spoken of plainly, but was nonetheless ever present in its implications. There was a new will, said Mrs. Simpkins, with studied casualness. Drawn up abroad, I was told. Switzerland, no less. Oh, yes. Mrs. Price nodded. I heard the solicitor himself, Mr. Alfred, visited her only last Thursday, and not at the house, mind you, but at the church. A moment of silence followed. The church was, after all, not the usual place to discuss legal affairs. Such matters, if they had to be addressed at all, were handled in parlors or discreet offices. Miss Marple, without looking up, made a note of the timeline. The will, the solicitor, the brooch, all within days of Mrs. Blackwell's death. It might mean nothing, of course, but in her experience, sudden shifts in legal arrangements so near to a person's end rarely went unnoticed, nor unresented, especially if what was inherited had once been assumed by someone else. The conversation, as it often did in such settings, drifted toward reminiscence. Mrs. Blackwell, it was remembered, had once been quite active in village affairs before the war, before Edward. "Such a fine boy," said Mrs. Harmon softly. "Always so polite to the older folk. I remember him bringing in a lost terrier one December. He must have been 15. He was listed missing, wasn't he?" asked Mrs. Price. "Not killed, just gone." "Yes," murmured Mrs. Wetherby, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "In Italy, I believe. And then she stopped coming to the Fed or anywhere at all. And that parcel," added Mrs. Simpkins suddenly, "do you remember? Came by registered post about a fortnight ago from Geneva. Annalisa signed for it." No one replied, but the implication was felt. Miss Marple folded her hands. A son missing not mourned openly. A parcel from abroad. A brooch that appeared from nowhere. If grief had a language, she thought it was often spoken in objects sent too late, received too quietly, and never quite explained. The ladies might have continued their speculation for hours, had not Colonel Mulchet's cousin, Mr. Henry Cresswell, a retired dealer in curios, happened upon the inn that very evening. Over a glass of brandy and a slice of cold ham, he recounted his time in Geneva and the strange coincidence of the brooch. "Saw one just like it," he said. "Swiss work, late 1930s, belonged to a nurse, Claudine Hella. Vanished during the last months of the war. No trace, just her brooch turning up in a parcel a year later with no return address." He did not think anything of it until he spotted the notice in the paper about Mrs. Blackwell's death and the mention of a brooch described in near identical terms. Miss Marple, who had not been present but heard it from Mrs. Banbury the following morning at the post office, felt the weight of that detail. A vanished woman, her brooch crossing borders, and a parcel sent from the very same place. War, she knew, had left behind more than graves. It had left tangled stories, with truths buried so deeply that even decades later they rose like frost through soil. In the days that followed, the church ver, Mr. Chataway, a precise man with little patience for frivolity, grew uncharacteristically discomposed. When asked by Mrs. Price whether the heating had failed during evening, he stammered oddly and referred her to the vicar. Miss Marple observed him one morning as he arranged flowers. His hands trembled, not with age, but with awareness, not guilt. She thought, but apprehension. He had seen something or heard something. Later that afternoon, he adjusted the altar cloth with meticulous care, yet left the candlestick slightly askew. That, Miss Marple noted, was unlike him. She did not press him. She had found over many years that silence in a guilty man was stubborn, but silence in a frightened one was full of clues. Back in her parlor, the click of Miss Marple's needles came to a halt. The wool, a soft dove gray, pulled in her lap as she sat quietly. The room washed in the gentle hush of twilight. She was not thinking of brooches or wills or missing sons directly. Instead, she thought of habits, of who called whom by first name, of who poured tea before milk, of who had repeated the phrase, so sudden too precisely. The pattern was beginning to form like stitches beneath her hands. And like all patterns, it was not what one saw first that mattered. It was what repeated quietly, what shifted slightly out of place, a brooch, a will, a parcel from abroad, a woman who did not belong, and someone Miss Marple now suspected, who had something to lose if the truth were spoken aloud. Miss Marple had always believed one could learn a great deal about a household by the things it preserved in full view. In Mrs. Blackwell's parlor, among the lace doilies and carefully folded antimacassars, stood a single silver-framed photograph. A young man in military uniform, his smile restrained, his eyes filled with that particular steadiness she had come to associate with those who had left and not returned. The frame had been recently polished, the glass free of dust. It had not been done for show, Miss Marple thought. It had been done out of habit. Devotion often lingered in such small rituals, even when the living no longer visited, and the heart had learned to move quietly around its ache. She stood a moment longer before turning away, not out of intrusion, but respect, The dead, after all, often spoke more clearly than the living, if one only looked. The village remembered Edward Blackwell with the peculiar clarity reserved for young men who had not grown old enough to disappoint. He had been polite, intelligent, possessed of a certain reserve not unlike his mother's, and had disappeared during his second year of service in Italy. Presumed dead, though never officially confirmed. At first there had been letters. Rosalind Blackwell had walked daily to the post box, often returning with envelopes pressed tightly in hand. Then the letters ceased. The walks became shorter, then stopped altogether. Her presence at the Women's Guild dwindled, as did her invitations to bridge. She had withdrawn from the rhythm of village life, not with bitterness, but with a kind of courteous vacancy, like a woman excusing herself early from a gathering. She never cried in public, Mrs. Harmon once said, but her mouth altered after the third year. It took on that pinched line, as though she were always waiting for the wrong visitor. Grief, Miss Marple knew, had a way of freezing time around it. Some women built their lives again, brick by steady brick. Others, like Rosalind, built silence and lived inside it. Annalisa had first arrived in the village as an assistant, a foreign girl with graceful manners and a quiet accent. At first, she was thought to be temporary, the sort of help that passes through and leaves no mark. But as months became years, she remained becoming nurse, housekeeper, perhaps something more. There were those in St. Mary who viewed her constancy with suspicion. It was not quite natural, they felt, for a woman of her bearing to content herself with so little. And yet there were others, Miss Marple among them, who recognized in Annalise a kind of loyalty that endured not out of obligation, but from something deeper and far more difficult to define. She seemed devoted, said Miss Barton, the church organist, but there was always something strained, as though she bore a responsibility not entirely hers. Miss Marple recalled a remark once overheard in the post office. Mrs. Banbury had said, "The Swiss girl's clever, too clever. She's inherited the household, without so much as a signature. But affection without clarity," Miss Marple thought, can become its own kind of resentment, especially when unspoken truths sit between two women like unwelcome guests. It was in the kitchen of Mrs. Linton's cottage, over a pot of barley tea, that Miss Marple heard of the final conversation. An odd flickering memory lit more by candle than comprehension. "She came by that evening," said Mrs. Linton, hands busy shelling peas, "just before the frost set in. Asked me if I remembered a woman named Heller. I didn't. Then she spoke of something that had come back to her. A thing, not a person. She didn't say what it was. No, only that it came too late, she said. You see, it was mine once, but not in the way he meant. And now it's too late to be forgiven." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. A brooch, perhaps, or a letter, or something symbolic of a wound long carried and only recently acknowledged. Mrs. Linton looked uneasy. She didn't sound angry, just emptied, as though something final had occurred, and she was already past it. Miss Marple, hearing this, considered how often the dead began to vanish from the inside out, long before the final breath came. Miss Marple, under the pretense of sorting a stack of out-of-date church records, passed a quiet hour in the parish office, leafing through correspondence, and envelopes meant to be catalogued or discarded. Among them were several items addressed to Mrs. Blackwell from a Mrs. Delford in Essex, an unfamiliar name, but the tone of the letters suggested kinship, not mere acquaintance. One envelope in particular held her attention. It had been forwarded from a Geneva address, redirected by hand, the script faint but unmistakably female. The content, she surmised from the reply tucked inside, was inquiring about the matter Edward never resolved. She later inquired discreetly at the post office. The Clare remembered the name. Mrs. Delaford had once been Rosalind's cousin by marriage, visited occasionally in the early 50s, then stopped. Family, but only barely. The phrase lingered. The matter Edward never resolved. Miss Marple closed the drawer and stood a moment with her gloved hand resting on the wood. Sometimes, she thought, a thread must be followed, not because it promises revelation, but because it knots all others in silence, until it is pulled. Mrs. Delaford received Miss Marple with mild surprise and a gracious pot of lemon tea. Her sitting room, lined with military portraits and framed embroidery, bore a stillness not unlike Rosalind's, but it was of a different kind, one that had found a way to accommodate the past. She asked me once, Mrs. Delford said, if I had heard rumors about Edward. This was after the war. I hadn't, not then. But later, Miss Marple inquired gently. Yes, the woman said, her hands folded neatly in her lap. In 1947, I heard from a mutual friend, a nurse who had been stationed in Florence. She said she had seen Edward alive under another name traveling with a group of displaced officers. No explanation. Did you tell Rosalind? I wrote. Whether she read it, I never knew. But I did receive one letter in return. 3 lines only. If it was him, he has chosen not to return. Let us leave him to it. Miss Marple was silent for a moment. To grieve a son lost is agony. But to know he lives and will not come home, that she thought is a sorrow with no name. Back in St. Mary Me, Miss Marple sat once more in the parlor of the deceased, this time alone, with the curtains drawn and the hush of early evening pressing in. She thought of Anais, her careful tread, her clipped tones, the way her eyes flickered whenever Edward's name arose. There had been affection between them. That was clear, but not ease. The kind of closeness shaped by habit and care, but never untainted by doubt. Annalise had remained at Rosalind's side for reasons not entirely spoken, and Rosalind in turn had both needed and resented her. In grief, some people drew others near. Others kept them close only as witnesses to what had been taken. Miss Marple glanced once more at the mantelpiece. The photograph still stood, still polished, a reminder of someone once beloved, then lost, and perhaps ultimately not forgiven. Some stories, she thought, are not ended by death. They are merely left unfinished. Miss Marple had always held that the measure of change in a person could often be best traced through the eyes of someone who had once fitted hems for them. And so she sat with Mrs. Fanshawe, retired seamstress and long-time mender of delicate linings, in the shaded parlor of the Arms house. She was quite the lady once, said Mrs. Fanshawe, adjusting her shawl. Liked her cuffs with Belgian edging, always precise, always polite. Then that telegram came and everything turned gray. What sort of gray? Miss Marple asked gently. Oh, not her clothes. Those stayed pale. But her voice, her steps. She stopped correcting my thread choice. After that, it was plain seams and silence. Do you recall when it was? Late 43, a week after that boy went missing in Italy. Edward, handsome thing, always helped carry my bag from the shop. Miss Marple let the silence stretch. Some griefs were not explosive. They seeped instead, steady and colorless, until they coated everything a woman touched. Mr. Alfred, the village solicitor, was not a man who enjoyed speculation. He preferred signatures to sentiments, and regarded Miss Marple with a respectful restraint, one afforded an elderly lady known to ask dangerous questions with disarming civility. Yes, there was a second will, he said, tapping a thin file. Drawn in Geneva, signed less than 6 months ago. Her earlier will left modest annuities to the church and various cousins, distant. This one, however, he paused, not for effect, but propriety. This one leaves everything to Miss Annalise Roth. Miss Marple nodded once, neither surprised nor pleased. And yet she remains under suspicion. Rather unfortunate, Alfred frowned. She didn't know about the change, if that's your angle. The documents were sent sealed. Mrs. Blackwell only mentioned it in passing. To tidy loose ends, she said. But I must admit, the suddenness of it all does raise eyebrows. And the cousins? Asked Miss Marple, enraged of course, particularly of Mr. Collingridge, who had already made inquiries about the cottage's value. Miss Marple's eyes twitched slightly. It's remarkable, isn't it, how death often summons affection in those with property to inherit. And in the absence of the rightful heir, Edward greed, she thought, found its way to the center of even the most orderly rooms. It was at Mrs. Harmon's garden tea that the name slipped out. The conversation had turned, as it often did, toward the past, toward ration books and evacuations, to soldiers who once courted girls behind the rose bushes of St. Mary Main. Major Alderton, said Mr. Sims absently, sipping weak lemonade. Now there was a man with a spine. Drank too much but never slurred a word. Used to come by in 44, I think. Knew young Edward Blackwell from the Italian campaign. The remark hung, then shifted, then was politely buried by another tale, but Miss Marple, seated under the lilac, noted it with quiet precision. Later that week, the name returned, half whispered by the Vere, muttered by the grocer sister. He was charming, someone said, but you couldn't quite trust him. Another recalled a rumor. Alderton had left the army under ambiguous circumstances. Miss Marple found herself revisiting her memory of Edward's portrait and the sorrow behind Rosalind's eyes. A man like Alderton, she thought, would have had the charm to gain trust and the ruthlessness to misuse it. And if he had vanished like Edward had, well, not all vanishing acts were created equal. Some left behind a memory. Others left a silence that trembled with guilt. It was through the charitable sewing circle that Miss Marple arranged a conversation with Miss Briar, a former matron now convalescing in a cottage on the edge of Gossington. I remember the brooch. Yes, said Miss Briar, peering at the sketch. Miss Marple had discreetly drawn. It belonged to Claudine Hella, Swiss Red Cross nurse. Lovely girl, too lovely. Attracted attention she didn't want. And what became of her? Miss Marple asked gently. Miss Briar sighed. Vanished. Geneva 45. Right after the liberation efforts. No body, no explanation. Just gone. She had any connection with officers? Miss Marple continued. Alderton, the woman said without hesitation. He used to leave flowers in the ward, white tulips. He had a way of speaking that made you feel you'd already agreed with him. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. And the brooch? She wore it always. Then one day it was gone. Same week as she disappeared. Miss Marple thanked her and left, her thoughts steady, but troubled. The brooch had changed hands. The woman had disappeared, and a man whose name was no longer spoken had walked away without questions. Sometimes the war took people by force, and sometimes it allowed others to disappear by design. It was Anna herself who, over a cup of chamomile tea in the shadowed kitchen of the Blackwell home, recalled the parcel's arrival. It came by post, registered. I signed for it. Swiss stamp, she said, her accent more pronounced in memory than in routine speech. Madame recognized the handwriting immediately. She said who it was from? Asked Miss Marple, folding her hands neatly. No, replied Anna, lowering her gaze. Only that it was not a gift. She went upstairs, locked the door. When I saw her again, she had changed her blouse, worn the brooch. Miss Marple nodded slowly, and her mood cold, distant, as if she had been given news she'd expected all her life, and wished she had not lived to receive. Did she speak of it again? Only once, she said. They will think it's beautiful, but it was never meant to shine. Miss Marple sipped her tea, and allowed the silence to stretch. Her brooch does not wound, but it can carry the wound of what was taken. And if Mrs. Blackwell had been waiting for the truth, she had received it not in comfort, but in confirmation of what had been lost and who had taken it. The parcel, it turned out, had not been empty of words after all. Miss Marple, in quiet conference with Inspector Cray from the county, was shown the single slip of paper retrieved from the discarded wrappings. Just 4 words. Now you know, no signature, no indication of sender, only the assertion, final and almost cruel in its restraint. Inspector Cray had dismissed it as sentimental melodrama, could be anything. A lover's regret, a forgotten debt. But Miss Marple disagreed. The note had arrived with a brooch long lost. A brooch last seen on a nurse who vanished, just as a certain officer's reputation collapsed. And if Mrs. Blackwell had received it shortly before her death, it was not the trinket that had stopped her heart, but what it represented, confirmation, not mystery, and a quiet accusation sent without ceremony. She had been told at last the truth she already suspected, not by word of mouth, not by confession, but by an object that should never have returned. Miss Marple held the note gently and murmured to herself, "The war is over." Yes, but for some, its messengers still arrive in brown paper with foreign ink, and no comfort in their message. The fire had not been lit. That was the curious thing. And yet the parlor was filled with smoke, low, curling acrid. It had been Mrs. Price from next door who noticed something was amiss. She'd come to return a borrowed casserole dish, and saw the haze billowing faintly behind the drawn curtains. Her knock went unanswered. By the time they forced the door open, Anna was found collapsed on the hearth rug, unconscious, but breathing. A half-burned newspaper smoldered in the grate. The fire had not caught, but had been laid. "She never lights the fire herself," said young Constable Simmons, glancing at the coals. "It's June." Miss Marple, who had arrived quietly amidst the confusion, looked about the room. The kettle had not boiled. There were no signs of food, no scattered papers, just the careful, unpleasant scent of something staged too neatly to be spontaneous. "She'd have left the door open if she intended to light a fire," Miss Marple said softly. "That room would have taken hours to warm." She studied the matchbox on the mantel, the scorched edge of a tea towel nearby, and a cushion on the floor. Upended, not fallen. Someone had meant for her to suffocate, but someone else or something had intervened. The arrest came swiftly, as such things often did when appearances demanded resolution. The coroner's inquest into Mrs. Blackwell's death had raised quiet doubts. Unresolved cardiac strain was the phrasing, but behind closed doors, whispers of something more deliberate had begun to circulate. And now, with Annalisa found barely breathing near a hastily lit fire, the suggestion of self-preservation became irresistible. She had means, Inspector Cray explained. Access, opportunity, and now perhaps motive. If she feared someone else knew. Miss Marple sat silently as the inspector relayed the sequence of events to the parish council. Annalisa had been seen at the bank the day before, inquiring about probate. She had collected post, shopped for lamb, and gone home with a quietness that seemed to some suspicious in itself. She had not spoken since regaining consciousness. At the station, she sat with a blanket around her shoulders, eyes dark, lips pressed shut, not sullen, hollow. "She doesn't believe she deserves to defend herself," Miss Marple observed to Mrs. Harmon that evening, "which is something quite different from guilt." "But why would someone want her gone?" Mrs. Harmon asked. Miss Marple replied, "Perhaps she knows something she doesn't realize is dangerous, and someone else does." By the following morning, another silence had taken hold. This one colder, more calculated. Mrs. Blackwell's brooch, once pinned to her coat, had quietly vanished. The vicer's wife had noticed it when they removed the body from the pew. A glint of pale blue stones on dark wool. But when the belongings were listed at the constable's office, the brooch was absent. Not listed among her jewelry. Not in the safe. Not with the solicitor. "It must have fallen," said Constable Simmons, without much conviction. Perhaps during the confusion, but Miss Marple, standing once again in the church aisle, disagreed. Bruise do not fall without notice, and certainly not when pinned through thick fabric. She had seen the pin, bent, forced perhaps, or repositioned. The question was not merely where it had gone, but why it had vanished only now. For some, a brooch was decoration. For others, it was a message. And in this case, Miss Marple suspected it was neither, but rather evidence, something worth removing and possibly worth killing for. Miss Marple had once said that tears, when genuine, were rarely loud. They surfaced not in sobs or outbursts, but in stillness, in the absence of performance. At the police station, Annalisa sat on a wooden bench beside a pane of fogged glass, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had refused breakfast, refused a solicitor. When Miss Marple was granted a few quiet moments with her, she found the woman looking not at the floor, but at nothing at all. She loved him, Annalise said suddenly, the words dry and brittle. "Not as you think. Not like that. She loved him because she failed him." "Edward?" Miss Marple asked gently. Annalisa nodded. "She said he wrote her a letter from Florence. She never showed me. But after it came, she changed. She became afraid of memory, of what she believed about him. And the brooch? It wasn't hers. Annalisa said she knew it. And still she wore it. Perhaps she wanted to be punished." Miss Marple reached out, not to touch, but to offer presence. "She forgave him," Annalise whispered. "I never could." It was not an admission of guilt. It was the crumbling of a wall long held in place. Sometimes innocence is not clean or cheerful. Sometimes it is bruised and silent, and weighted by love that has turned inwards. That Sunday, Miss Marple asked to assist the vicar in preparing the quarterly donation records. A simple favor, and one she had offered more than once before. In the vestry, among ink bottles and folded collection slips, she read each line with quiet precision. Then, quite without flourish, she paused. An entry 3 weeks prior, £10 anonymous, with a line marked only E.B. Curious, she murmured. Our dear curate's handwriting, but the initials are not his. She waited until the vicar returned and asked casually who had submitted it. Oh, that one came by post, he replied, retrieving the envelope. Forwarded from Geneva. Oddly enough, a note enclosed just a line in gratitude for mercy, from a grateful son. Miss Marple took the envelope in hand. The paper was thick, the address written in an angled hand. She had seen such penmanship before, disciplined, continental. She did not need to speak the name aloud. She already knew. Edward Blackwell, a man declared missing, a man who had chosen for reasons perhaps justifiable only to himself not to return. But men do not remain missing forever. Some return quietly. Some send gifts in remorse, and some sign only their initials. With the envelope still folded in her handbag, Miss Marple made a quiet journey to the county records office. There, in a high-ceiling room smelling faintly of ink and stone, she was greeted by Mr. Pendry, an old acquaintance with a fondness for train timetables and military registries. Edward Blackwell, he said, adjusting his spectacles. Yes, presumed missing, but oh, what's this? He drew out a secondary file. Alias registered in 47. Legal but concealed. Applied under the name Edward Bond. Employment and shipping records. Geneva. Address corresponds to the one you've brought. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Was the alias known to the family? Not officially, but he declared no dependents. Left the country twice. Returned once last winter. She thanked him and left, the slip of paper now burning faintly against the inside of her bag. So Edward had not died. He had simply stepped aside, leaving his mother to grieve him, his name to vanish, and the truth to arrive far too late. And now someone else had paid the price for the silence he never broke. Miss Marple had long observed that few places held more quiet confessions than the post office. It was a place of routine, of small declarations wrapped in brown paper, of handwriting that betrayed far more than the words themselves. When she visited that morning, ostensibly to collect a parcel of embroidery cotton, she made a quiet request to Mrs. Featherstone behind the counter. I wondered, she said gently, whether you still keep the old registry slips from foreign parcels. There was one from Geneva a few weeks ago. Mrs. Featherstone, flattered and untroubled by the question, brought out a bound ledger and a shallow tray of slips. Miss Marple leafed through them with the care of a woman browsing recipes, calm, exacting. There it was, a thin slip dated 10 days before Mrs. Blackwell's death. Pale blue ink, unmistakable. The signature read H. Tux. Miss Marple folded the slip and tucked it into her bag with the quiet grace of someone pocketing memory rather than evidence. Names she had learned could change, but hands rarely did. At home, Miss Marple retrieved a letter she had once received years earlier from the War Office forwarded on behalf of a mutual acquaintance regarding the disappearance of a village boy. It bore no direct relevance now, save for one detail. Its author had signed with a flourish, just like that on the parcel slip, the same angled slope to the T, the same conservative spacing. She placed the two pieces of paper side by side on her writing desk. A lifetime of noticing patterns of lace, of stitching, of the loops in capital letters, had trained her eye well. Harold Tukes, a name that meant little, but beneath the ink, the ghost of another began to emerge. She recalled the name Major Alderton murmured uneasily weeks ago, and how it lingered like a scent from an unopened drawer. It was Mrs. Harmon who mentioned in passing that Mr. Tukes kept to himself these days, worked at the local depot, and spoke rarely of the war, except when in company with a vicar, whom he tolerated, but did not trust, a man reinvented, but not erased. Miss Marple prepared her hat and gloves. A question about village history, gently posed, might unearth what official channels had long overlooked. Mr. the Harold Tukes lived in a modest cottage on the northern edge of St. Mary-Meet past the orchard bend, where the hedges grew high and the gate creaked from disuse. Miss Marple arrived mid-afternoon, carrying a thin notebook, and a purposeful smile. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you," she said warmly. "The vicar suggested you might be knowledgeable about wartime records. I'm preparing a little local booklet on those who served. So many names fade, you see." He was courteous but wary, a man who had learned to offer welcome with one hand and caution with the other. "I suppose I remember a few," he replied, his voice low and grained by years, though most who served did so without need for commemoration. Miss Marple made no comment, merely seated herself and began her questions. She asked after regiment's recollections who served where. Mr. Tukes answered easily, though certain names made his eyes flicker. Edward Blackwell, for instance, or Claudine Hella. The nurse, he asked far too quickly. Didn't realize she was from around here. "Oh, she wasn't," Miss Marple said mildly. "But things travel, stories, objects." His expression closed slightly. "Yes," he said, "they do." Miss Marple smiled gently. Some confessions arrived wrapped in bravado, others in silence. It was always the small things that betrayed the truth. Mr. Tukes spoke for over an hour, his tone never raised, his words carefully paced. But Miss Marple noticed how his fingers tightened whenever the war was mentioned, how his gaze strayed from her face when she asked about Florence, and how when she mentioned the brooch, without name, only description, he stood to adjust the curtain, though no sun troubled the glass. "She wore it often, I believe," Miss Marple offered gently. The nurse, it was rather distinctive. "I wouldn't know," he said too swiftly. "Not much use for jewelry in field hospitals. But in peacetime, she asked for someone who no longer wore a uniform. A civilian, perhaps." He did not answer. Then too quickly he spoke of Edward Blackwell. A good soldier, quiet, not one for questions, could take orders without fuss. Miss Marple looked steadily at him. "And yet I understand he vanished. Not killed, not found." Mr. Tukes drew in his breath, then laughed. "Dry thin. War loses many men, Miss Marple. Some on paper, some by choice." Her eyes did not move, and some because someone else had more to gain if they never returned. The silence that followed was not denial. It was memory breaking its hold. Miss Marple left the cottage as the light began to slant gold across the hedge. She walked slowly, her hands folded in front of her, as if the motion of her body might help untangle the threads now tightening in her mind. It was no longer the brooch alone. That glittering heirloom so carelessly reassigned had become a token of something far larger, an identity taken, a life buried under another story. Edward Blackwell had not died. He had been erased, not by war, but by a man who saw in his disappearance an opportunity. Her new name, a parcel posted, a brooch sent at last like a curse too long withheld. It was the theft of a memory, not a thing. The quietest kind of murder, not of flesh, but of legacy. And the woman who had worn it at last, who had received it without explanation, had died not from poison or knife, but from the weight of knowing. Miss Marple stepped slowed as she passed the church gate, the evening bell just beginning its solemn rhythm. A man's name can change, she thought. Her signature may shift, but the guilt beneath it remains unchanged, persistent as winter ivy, growing through cracks even decades old. Harold Tukes, once Major Alderton, had lived beneath that name for nearly 30 years, and in that time he had spoken little, laughed less, and never dared call himself innocent. The parcel he had sent had not been to soothe a wound, but to force it open. A cruel redemption, perhaps, or merely a burden passed on to one who could no longer reply. Miss Marple reached her garden gate and paused. Truth, when buried, never rests easy, and memory, like justice, has a way of returning quietly in the handwriting of a ghost. The vicar's drawing-room with its worn Persian rug and slightly musty scent of old hymnals served that afternoon not as a courtroom, but as a chamber of quiet reckoning. Miss Marple had requested the gathering with such gentle firmness that none had thought to refuse. Anala sat upright in a modest armchair, pale but composed. The solicitor, Mr. Ulford, arrived precisely on time, his briefcase unopened. The verger, Mr. Chataway, lingered near the window, hands clasped, eyes darting, and last Mr. Harold Tukes stood by the hearth, as though uncertain whether to stay or flee. Miss Marple, with her knitting basket on her lap, and no need for spectacle. Address them in a tone no louder than conversation over tea. I thought, she said mildly, it might be time to lay out the facts plainly. So much has been assumed, so little understood. No one spoke, not out of fear, but because they sensed something long-shadowed was about to be brought into the light. It began, Miss Marple said with the brooch. Not its appearance, though that was curious, but its origin. It is not a family piece, as some assumed. It was never worn by Mrs. Blackwell until the evening of her death. She held up a small sketch of the item, rendered with neat, measured lines. This brooch once belonged to Claudine Heller, a nurse stationed in Geneva in 1944. She vanished under unclear circumstances. No body, no explanation, only silence and the disappearance of the brooch. Annalisa flinched slightly. Mr. Tukes narrowed his gaze. The piece reappeared, not in a collection or sale, but in a parcel sent from Geneva, signed anonymously, yet penned by a familiar hand. That parcel arrived shortly before Mrs. Blackwell's death, and within it this brooch, once lost, now a message. Miss Marple turned to Mr. Alfred. There was no reason for the item to arrive by post, save for what it carried. An accusation, quiet, personal, the kind that does not require explanation. She paused. It was not meant as a gift. It was meant as a reckoning. And in that quiet room, everyone knew it had achieved its aim. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. Edward Blackwell, she said softly, was not killed in the war. He disappeared, yes, but he lived under another name, away from England, away from this village. The room held its breath. I traced a donation made to the church in the name of gratitude signed with the initials E.B. and sent from a Geneva address. That address is linked to a man who served in the Italian campaign under Major Alderton. She let the name hang. Edward, it seems, discovered something toward the end of the war. Looting, perhaps misuse of aid, a betrayal of conduct by a superior officer. He was silenced, not murdered, but erased. She turned toward Mr. Tukes, and he remained silent. Whether out of shame or fear, I cannot say, but his mother believed him dead. His name was spoken only in the past tense, his life rewritten by those who had more to gain from his absence. The verge crossed himself, his mouth twitching. Mr. Alfred looked down. It is not only murder, Miss Marple said. That takes a life. Sometimes it is betrayal. Quiet, enduring, and far more deliberate. She waited, Miss Marple continued. For years, for news, for explanation. None came. And then, without warning, this brooch arrived. No letter, no name, just a token. She looked gently at Annalisa. You remember the day it came. Annalisa gave a faint nod. Her lips pressed tight. She wore it that evening, not proudly, but purposefully, as though to declare something, to face something, and then she died. The solicitor cleared his throat, but Miss Marple pressed on. The cause was listed as heart failure, but the heart, you see, can break in more ways than one. She did not die from disease. She died from the weight of knowing. She turned again toward Mr. Tukes. She was not sent a memory. She was sent guilt, packaged in silver filigree and pale blue stones. A message not of love, but of cowardice finally confronted. Silence again, but this time charged with something deeper. She forgave him, said Annalise quietly, her voice shaking, but not herself. Miss Marple nodded slowly. That is the tragedy, for it was never her fault. She only bore what others refused to carry. All eyes turned now to Harold Tukes. The man did not speak, but in the lines of his face was the weight of years, unspoken truths, quiet evasions, and a name no longer his own. You were once Major Alerton, Miss Marple said evenly. Decorated, respected, but not blameless. Still, he said nothing. You sent the parcel, she continued. Not out of compassion, but because it weighed too heavily, not as a confession, but as an exorcism. Mr. Tukes stared at the fire grate. I thought she ought to know, he said at last before she died. Miss Marple's expression did not change. And yet you never considered that knowing would be her undoing. She wrote once, he said, his voice dry to Geneva, asked if I had seen him. I never answered. I thought it better that way. No, said Miss Marple softly. You thought it easier. He lifted his head slowly. She would have forgiven him, he said. I never could. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. And so you allowed her to live with silence, with grief, with a lie you had the power to undo. He closed his eyes, and the truth, finally spoken, seemed far heavier than the silence that had preceded it. No handcuffs were raised. No trial would follow. The law, Miss Marple knew, had no clear avenue for such matters. The dead could not testify. The brooch proved nothing. And yet justice, real justice, had already unfolded, not in courtrooms, but here. Harold Tukes, Miss Marple said quietly, will not be prosecuted, but he will not be forgotten, and that, I think, is its own form of reckoning. Mr. Alfred nodded, grave. The Veer murmured something about prayer. Annalisa stood, tears silent, and did not look back as she left the room. Miss Marple remained seated, hands resting on her basket. There are many ways to take a life, she said at last, some with force, some with silence. But the truth, when it comes, asks only one thing, that we see it plainly. And in that drawing room, it had been seen. The roses had come in early that year, blush pink and soft yellow, their petals delicate as breath. Miss Marple sat among them in the dappled light, her tea set arranged neatly on the small wrought-iron table by the hedge. A fine breeze stirred the ivy on the trellis. The village was quiet. In her lap lay her knitting, untouched. Her mind, however, was not idle. It wandered gently to a brooch, silver, cold, and once burdened with grief. It had since been locked away with Mrs. Blackwell's few remaining effects, its meaning no longer contested, yet never fully explained. She thought of Edward, not lost to death, but to something quieter and more enduring, and of Annalise, whose devotion had weathered more than duty, and of Harold Tukes, now a man without illusions. Some stories, Miss Marple mused, and not in answers, but in recognitions. As she poured her tea, she considered that memory, when sharpened by truth, could pierce more deeply than any knife. But it could also, if understood in time, heal. Not all pain needed to be solved, she reminded herself. Some merely needed to be acknowledged. Annalisa departed early before most of the village had risen. Her trunk had been packed with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had long known how to leave without fuss. No announcement, no farewell visit to the vicarage, just a small envelope left with Mrs. Harmon containing a donation for the church garden and a brief note of thanks. She never asked for anything, the vicar's wife said quietly. Not even kindness. Miss Marple nodded. Number, but she gave it. That is far rarer. The station master later said she wore no hat, and her coat was buttoned to the neck, despite the warmth. She looked forward, not back. There was no family waiting for her where she went, only distance and perhaps a quieter life. But she had left something behind in St. Mary, Maine. Not scandal nor shame, but something more fragile and enduring. Understanding. It was scarcely a fortnight later that the for-sale board was taken down. A young woman, Miss Elaine Marchbanks, recently appointed headmistress of the county school, took possession of the Blackwell cottage with cheerful curiosity and a fondness for hydrangeas. She remarked to the postmaster that the place felt full of character, though she couldn't quite say why. She liked the built-in bookshelves and the narrow stairs. The wallpaper, she said, reminded her of her grandmother's flat in Surrey. Miss Marple met her once in passing, exchanged pleasantries about pruning roses, and thought how naturally life folded over memory. Miss Marchbanks knew nothing of the brooch, nothing of Edward, nothing of the silence once kept behind those walls. And that perhaps was just as it should be. The past, Miss Marple reflected, does not ask to be forgotten, only respected and sometimes left alone. The church bell tolled the hour, its tone low and deliberate. Miss Marple, seated by the window, sipped her tea, and watched the sun slip along the garden path. People often imagine that secrets hid in silence, but she had come to learn otherwise. It's the things we speak of too politely, she murmured, that remained the longest unspoken. The roses stirred in the breeze, fragrant and blooming. The village has ever moved forward, but a little wiser now, and perhaps a touch more tender with its ghosts. In the end, it wasn't the brooch that mattered. It was everything it carried silently through the years, her soldiers' lost name, her mother's broken heart, and the quiet burden of guilt that refused to fade. Miss Marple didn't shout her discovery. She never does. Instead, she watched, listened, and saw how silence itself can become an inheritance, passed down like an heirloom, stitched between generations, heavy with things never said. And perhaps that's the truth of life in a village like St. Mary, Maine. Beneath the roses and the tea trays lie wounds that never made it into history books, but shaped lives all the same. But tell me, what would you have done if that parcel had arrived at your door? Would you have opened it, told someone, or kept it quietly as a memory too sharp to share? Let us know in the comments. Truly, we love reading your thoughts, your theories, and the ways you would have seen the story. It also helps more kindred mystery lovers find their way to this little corner of tea, memory, and suspense. And if you enjoyed this journey through secrets and shadows, do subscribe to the channel for more Miss Marple-style mysteries. Share it with someone who enjoys quiet stories, with deep roots and human truths. Every new subscriber, every thoughtful comment helps keep these stories blooming, just like the roses in Miss Marple's garden. Now, until next time, keep your eyes open, your ears keen, and never underestimate what the quietest people often see.